You are standing by a dead antelope roughly 10 million years ago on the edge of a wooded floodplain in what is now northern Kenya. You are hungry. The animal has hide that your fingernails cannot open and your teeth cannot properly tear. You have hands, you have a brain slightly bigger than a chimpanzee's. And somewhere nearby there are rocks. You pick one up, you strike it against another rock, not randomly, but with an angle, a purpose. A flake breaks off, thin, sharp along one edge, sharper than anything your own body can produce. You press it into the hide, it opens. That is the whole invention. That is the entire idea behind every knife that has ever existed, from that flake of volcanic rock to a surgeon's scalpel to a Swiss Army knife in someone's pocket right now. Take something hard, break it in a way that leaves an edge thinner than the material you want to cut. Use that edge instead of your body. That is it. That is the knife. And getting from a lucky flake of stone to a folding titanium blade took nearly the entire span of human existence, plus a fair amount of the existence of things that were not yet human at all. So where did it start? Not with humans. That is the first thing that surprises people. In 2011, a team from the West Turkana Archaeological Project, led by Sonia Harmond and Jason Lewis, was searching the dry riverbeds near Lake Turkana in Kenya when a colleague, Sami Lokorodi, spotted stone flakes eroding out of the ground at a site called Lomekwai Sen. When the team dated the surrounding sediment, the tools came back at 10 million years old, publishing their findings in Nature announcing Ishawu. That is, yin years older than the previous record holder. The Oldowan tools from Ethiopia's Gona region, and it predates the genus Homo entirely. Whoever made these tools was almost certainly an Australopithecine, something closer to Lucy than to us, with a brain barely larger than a modern chimp's. The tools themselves were crude and heavy, some weighing several kilograms, made by resting a stone on an anvil and battering it with a hammerstone, rather than the more controlled flaking techniques that came later. But the scars on the rock show intention. Someone was trying to produce a specific kind of edge, and they knew on some level that a broken edge cuts better than a smooth one. Before there was a genus Homo, before there was language, before there was fire, there was already an edge, and there was already someone who understood what an edge was for. The technology got better fast, at least on a geological time scale. By nil million years ago, hominins at Gona in Ethiopia were producing what archaeologists call Oldowan tools, named after Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where Louis and Mary Leakey first identified them in the Eastern. In 1930, these were smaller, more deliberately shaped flakes, struck off a stone core with real technique, not just battering. And we know exactly what they were used for because the evidence is written directly onto animal bone cut marks. Fine. Parallel grooves on fossilized bones from that period show hominins slicing meat off carcasses. Sometimes carcasses they had scavenged from actual predators. A stone flake let an early hominin do something its jaw and fingernails physically could not, strip a kill down to the bone in minutes instead of hours. That single advantage, the ability to process meat quickly and efficiently, is one of the leading explanations for why our ancestors' brains started growing. Meat is calorie-dense. A knife, even a crude flake of chert, is what let a small jan-bodied, slow, weak jan-jawed primate access those calories at scale. In a very real sense, you can trace a line from that first stone flake to the extra tissue in your skull right now. For most of human prehistory, the knife did not change much in principle, only in precision. Homo sapiens and their relatives kept striking stone, but they got extraordinarily good at it. Around 90 years ago, toolmakers associated with the Solutrean culture in what is now France and Spain were producing blades through pressure flaking, pressing a pointed tool, often made of antler or bone, against the edge of a stone core to pop off long, thin, almost translucent blades with astonishing precision. Some Solutrean laurel dan leaf points are so thin and symmetrical that modern flintknappers still struggle to replicate them, and obsidian, volcanic glass, turned out to be the single best material available anywhere on Earth for this purpose. An obsidian edge properly flaked can be only a few nanometers thick at the very tip, thinner than a steel surgical scalpel. which is why some modern eye surgeons have used obsidian blades for the most delicate incisions. Because obsidian fractures at the molecular level and leaves less scar tissue than metal Mesoamerican cultures, particularly the Aztec, industrialized this. Skilled craftsmen could strike dozens of nearly identical prismatic blades from a single obsidian core in an afternoon, each one razor-sharp straight off the stone with no grinding or polishing required. Long before anyone smelted a single gram of metal, humans had already produced a cutting edge sharper than anything a modern factory. Turns out by default, stone was never really the weak link. Stone was, in some ways, the peak. The actual limitation of stone was not sharpness. It was durability and shape. A flint blade holds an edge like almost nothing else, but it is brittle. It chips, it snaps, it cannot be reshaped once it fails, only regen flaked into something smaller. And that is the problem metal eventually solved. Not by cutting better, but by cutting for longer and bending instead of breaking. The transition shows up almost perfectly preserved in one particular body. In September 1991, two German hikers found a corpse melting out of a glacier in the Fatale Alps on the border of Austria and Italy. Fetzi, as he came to be known, died roughly 1000 years ago, and his equipment is the most complete surviving toolkit from the Copper Age anywhere in the world. He carried a copper axe, blade nearly 90% pure copper, hafted into a U handle with birch tar and leather lashings. Copper-sourced researchers later determined from as far away as southern Tuscany. But his knife, his actual cutting tool for close work, was not copper. It was flint. A small triangular blade, only about 6 centimeters, including its ashwood handle, kept in a woven bast sheath and resharpened so many times over its life that the blade had shrunk down to barely more than an arrowhead. Even a man walking around with one of the most advanced metal tools of his entire era still trusted stone for his knife. Copper, in the earliest metal age, was reserved for the axe. For status, for heavy chopping, it took a while before metal was trusted or available or affordable enough to become the edge in someone's hand. Between that copper Dan and Dan Flint world and the age of true iron smelting, there is one more strange detour worth taking, because for a few centuries, iron was not a common metal at all. It was rarer than gold, and the only source anyone had was the sky. In Iten by Arshawu, while unwrapping the mummy of the pharaoh Tutankhamun, who died around Iten by Arshasen BCE, excavators working under Howard Carter found a dagger roughly 6 centimeters long with a gold hilt and an iron blade, buried more than 2,000 years before Egypt developed its own iron sand smelting industry. For decades, the blade's origin was debated, until a Lianzhen in Ishidil Tudi, led by Daniela Camelli, using portable X-ray fluorescence spectrometry, measured the blade's nickel and cobalt content and found it matched the composition of iron meteorites far more closely than any known terrestrial ore. Tutankhamun's dagger was not made from mined and smelted iron at all. It was forged, cold worked, or carefully heated, from a chunk of metal that had fallen out of space, and ancient Egyptian texts from the period even describe iron using a phrase that translates roughly to metal of the sky. In a world that had not yet learned to smelt iron or reliably, a knife made from a meteorite was, quite literally, the most exotic and valuable blade a person could own, more precious than the solid gold surrounding it in the same tomb that changed with bronze, and then decisively with iron. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, held an edge better than pure copper and could be cast into far more consistent shapes. Blade after blade poured from the same mold, but it was iron, and specifically the ability to add carbon to iron to make steel, that finally gave metal an actual advantage over flint rather than just a convenience one. Iron ore was vastly more abundant than tin, which had to be traded across enormous distances in the Bronze Age. And a steel edge, unlike a stone one, could be resharpened dozens of times without losing its basic shape. The Iron Age beginning in different regions at different times, but broadly from around Iten by BCE onward, is really the story of knives becoming permanent objects instead of disposable ones. A stone blade was something you made new when the old one snapped. An iron knife was something you owned, maintained, and passed down. And somewhere in that transition, someone had an idea that seems almost too modern for the era it came from. A knife that folds. Archaeologists working at a Roman Zan-era site in Britain uncovered an iron folding knife dating to around the RND century CE, its handle carved from bone into the shape of a running dog, the blade pivoting into a slot in the handle exactly the way a modern pocketknife works. The Romans were producing folding utility knives with bone or wood scales, nearly 2,000 years before anyone patented the design. It is a small, almost funny detail that most people assume the folding knife is a product of the industrial age, when in fact Roman legionaries may have carried something recognizably similar to a modern Swiss army knife tucked into their kit on the frontier. But the real leap in edge quality, the one that separates a merely functional blade from a legendary one, came from a metallurgical trick perfected in South India roughly 2,300 years ago. Crucible steel, later known across the Islamic world and Europe as woots, was produced by sealing iron along with carbon-rich plant material and sometimes glass inside a sealed clay crucible, and heating it to a point where the iron partially melted and absorbed carbon evenly throughout the metal, producing an unusually pure, high-carbon steel with almost no slag impurities, traded northwest along overland routes. This steel reached smiths in Persia, Syria, and the broader Middle East where it was forged, not melted again, but carefully hammered at controlled temperatures into blades that displayed a distinctive rippling watery pattern across their surface, the visible signature of carbide bands within the steel. European crusaders called this Damascus steel after the Syrian city where much of the trade and finishing took place, and the blades acquired a reputation, not entirely undeserved, for holding an edge sharp enough to slice through silk dropped onto it and durable enough to survive combat that would shatter an ordinary iron sword. The exact original Wootz production technique was eventually lost. The ore sources that gave the steel its particular trace elements dried up, and by the 18th century, nobody could fully reproduce it anymore. It remains one of the only cases in the history of metallurgy where humanity invented something, mastered it for 2,000 years, and then simply forgot how, while Wootz was quietly perfecting itself in South India, and Damascus workshops were hammering it into legend. Medieval Europe was building its own blade dynasties, not through a single metallurgical secret, but through concentrated generational craft knowledge locked inside guilds. Solingen, a town in what is now North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany, sits on the Wupper River, and that detail matters more than it sounds like it should. Fast-flowing water meant water-powered trip hammers and grinding wheels centuries before steam power existed anywhere, and the surrounding hills supplied both iron ore and the forests needed to fuel the furnaces. The first documented mention of blade manufacturing in Solingen dates to 1363, and by 1401 the town had a formal guild of hardeners and grinders, followed in 1571 by an official knife-makers guild. These guilds did not just regulate quality, they hoarded it, treating tempering ratios and grinding techniques as family secrets passed down inside a small number of workshop dynasties, stamping finished blades, "Me fecit Solingen." Solingen made meat as a mark of trust that functioned centuries before anyone coined the phrase made in Germany. By the late 1600s, more than 300 families in the region were actively engaged in sword and blade making, and Solingen had grown into a genuine rival to both Damascus and the Spanish city of Toledo, another town whose name became a byword for blade quality thanks to its own closely guarded steel and tempering methods, refined under a mix of Roman, Visigothic, and Moorish metallurgical traditions layered on top of each other over centuries. Toledo steel became so trusted across Europe that a Toledo blade could function as a kind of passport of quality on any battlefield or in any royal armory, exactly the same reputation, through craft, secrecy that Solingen was building in parallel a few hundred miles north, without either town needing to know precisely what the other was doing differently. On the other side of the world, entirely independently, Japanese smiths were solving the same fundamental problem, a blade that is hard enough to hold a razor edge without being so brittle that it snaps using a completely different process. Traditional Japanese swordsmiths smelted iron sand in a clay furnace called a tatara to produce tamahagan, jewel steel, then folded and hammered the resulting steel back on itself repeatedly, sometimes 10 times or more, doubling the layers with each fold until a single billet contained thousands of microscopic layers of steel, working out impurities and distributing carbon content evenly through the process. Crucially, smiths coated the spine of the blade with a thick clay slurry and the edge with a thin one before quenching the hot steel in water. So the thin jan-coated edge cooled fast into hard, brittle martensite, while the thick jan-coated spine cooled slowly into soft, flexible perlite, a single blade with two different personalities, one hard enough to hold a razor edge, one flexible enough not to snap in a strike. That differential hardening is why a traditional Japanese blade shows the visible hamon lines separating edge from spine, and it is the exact same underlying materials problem, hard versus tough, that Indian woodsmiths and European swordsmiths were fighting from a completely different angle on a completely different continent, at almost the same broad slice of history. Different bones, same skeleton of a problem. Steel edges kept improving in small increments for centuries after that. But the next genuinely large leap did not come from a legendary sword zandsmithing tradition. It came from a Sheffield metallurgist trying to solve a problem that had nothing to do with cutlery at all. In Iten Jobat Ishar, Harry Brearley, working at the Brown Firth Research Laboratories, was asked to find an alloy that could resist the erosion caused by hot gases in small arms gun barrels. Through Iten Jobat Ishar Senxiaoshi, he tested a series of chromium steels, and on the Shisen Th of August that year, he produced a batch, roughly 4% chromium and 10% carbon, that stubbornly refused to etch or rust under the acid tests he used to examine its structure. Brearley initially assumed the sample was simply resisting his reagents by accident. It took him time to realize the steel itself did not corrode. He tried to interest his employer in the discovery for weapons applications, and they were not interested. So he pushed it toward cutlery instead, sending samples to Sheffield cutlers who initially reported back that the new alloy would not forge, would not grind properly, and would not hold an edge. A story local gossip apparently turned into the joke that Brearley had invented a knife that would not cut. He kept pushing anyway. Within a decade, stainless steel cutlery was standard, and the material eventually spread into surgical instruments, industrial blades, and eventually the pocket knives and kitchen knives that make up the overwhelming majority of blades produced today. It is worth sitting with the fact that the material inside the knife in most people's kitchen drawer exists because a metallurgist was trying to stop a gun barrel from corroding and only reluctantly agreed to try it on a fork. American knife design took its own detour in the Shizhou Th century, driven less by metallurgy than by a very specific, very practical problem: frontier life and frontier violence. The Bowie knife, associated with the American frontiersman James Bowie, and the deadly Itzen Baba Arshitsi sandbar fight in Louisiana, where Bowie reportedly used a large knife to kill a man in a brawl that became instant frontier legend, was less a single invention than a whole style. A large single-jan-edged fighting and utility blade with a clip point. Sturdy enough to baton through wood and skin game, long enough to function as a backup weapon on a frontier where firearms were still slow to reload. Sheffield cutlers, sensing an enormous export market, began mass jan-producing Bowie jan-style knives by the thousands for the American market throughout the mid-Fu Itzen Babai Mouse, an odd historical loop where a frontier legend from Louisiana became one of the biggest cutlery export industries for the same English city that decades later would give the world stainless steel. And the story does not stop with fixed blades and folding pocket knives either. In Itzen Babai Joshi, a Swiss cutler named Karl Elsner, frustrated that Swiss soldiers were being issued German Zen-made pocket knives because no domestic manufacturer could produce enough of them, founded what became Victorinox and began producing a folding knife for the Swiss army that combined a blade, an AWL, a can opener, and a screwdriver into a single tool. A few years later, he patented a thinner spring mechanism that let him mount tools on both sides of the handle, doubling the knife's utility without doubling its bulk. And the modern multi-dan tool pocket knife was born from a fairly mundane military procurement complaint. It is one of the more understated origin stories in this entire history, a soldier's paperwork problem quietly producing one of the most recognizable tools on Earth. That same Sheffield Jan versus Jan Solingen rivalry, craftsmen guarding a formula while quietly trying to out-Jan engineer each other, never really stopped. It just moved into a laboratory setting with better instruments. Modern knife steel is no longer poured and hammered by feel the way Brearley's chromium batches were. Most high-gen performance blade steel today is made through a process called powder metallurgy, where molten steel is atomized into a fine powder and then compressed and sintered under extreme heat and pressure, a method that lets metallurgists pack in exotic alloying elements, vanadium, molybdenum, niobium, at levels that would form unusable clumps of brittle carbide if the steel were simply cast in liquid form the old way. Steels developed this way, with names like S-Centure or M-Senjodine, can hold a working edge for multiple times longer than a basic stainless blade, before needing a touch Dan up, essentially trading some of the East Jan versus Jan-West secrecy that defined Damascus and Solingen for open metallurgical papers and patent filings. Though knife companies still guard their exact heat Jan treatment recipes, the way a Solingen family once guarded its tempering ratio. And at the far edge of that same trajectory, some manufacturers have gone back, in a strange full circle, to something closer to stone. Modern ceramic knives, most commonly made from zirconium oxide, fired at extreme temperatures into an extraordinarily hard, chemically inert blade, hold an edge for years without sharpening and never rust, because unlike steel, they contain no iron to oxidize in the first place. They are, in effect, a laboratory Jan-grown precision Jan-manufactured descendant of that original obsidian flake, from Lomiquai, hard, brittle, inert, and sharper for longer than almost anything humans have ever cut with, arriving at essentially the same material logic that a hominin discovered by accident sen million years earlier, purely because it happened to be standing next to the right kind of rock. Every one of these inventions, the Lomiquai flake, the Solutrean blade, Fates's resharpened flint, Wootz steel, Tamahagane, stainless steel, the Bowie knife, the Swiss Army knife, is the same underlying idea solved again from a different angle. Take something harder than the thing you want to cut. Give it a thinner edge than the thing you want to cut. Make that edge last as long as you possibly can. The materials changed. Obsidian to copper to bronze to iron to crucible steel to stainless steel to today's high Jan vanadium powder metallurgy blades and ceramic edges that never need sharpening because they barely wear at all. But the underlying demand never changed, and it never will, because it is not really a demand for a weapon or even primarily for a tool. It is a demand for control, the ability to separate one thing from another exactly where you want the separation to happen. Meat from bone, rope from itself, wood from wood, thread from thread, on your terms, instead of relying on the blunt, slow, unreliable tools your own body came with. Tonight somewhere, a chef is running a steel blade through an onion without thinking about the fact that the geometry of that edge is the direct descendant of a chert flake struck by something that was not quite human. Sen million years ago, on the shore of a lake in Kenya, someone camping is unfolding a pocket knife descended, however distantly, from a Roman legionary's bone, Jan-handled utility blade. A surgeon somewhere is drawing a scalpel, still sometimes made of obsidian for the finest work. Across skin with the same core principle a hominin used on an antelope carcass before there was a written word for any of it. The knife is not one invention. It is the same idea, discovered independently, refined obsessively, across every continent and every age humans have occupied, because the problem it solves, how do I divide the world exactly where I want it divided, is older than our species and will very likely outlast whatever material we eventually decide is sharper than steel.